In the architectural masterpiece known as the Obsidian, the air always smelled of white tea and old money. But for Eleanor, standing behind the cold quartz desk at 2 a.m., it smelled like a cage. Manhattan was freezing outside, a bruised violet winter, but inside, Eleanor was perfectly preserved in temperature-controlled isolation. She was the night concierge, the invisible woman. At 25, she wore her midnight blue uniform like a costume that didn't quite fit. It was tailored, elegant, and designed to make her blend into the dark marble walls, ensuring she was available but never obtrusive. She was a gatekeeper of secrets for the city's elite. She accepted late-night deliveries of flowers meant for mistresses. She called discreet taxis for politicians stumbling out at dawn, and she held the spare keys to penthouses she could never afford to rent in 1,000 lifetimes. Once, her hands had been calloused from the strings of a cello, moving with a passion that had won her scholarships and applause in concert halls. But that was before the accident that took her mother, before the debt swallowed her inheritance, and before the music stopped. Now, her hands only handled packages and buzzed open doors. She was a prodigy turned servant, hiding her brilliance behind a polite smile and a lowered gaze. We build walls to keep the world out, never realizing we are locking ourselves in with the ghosts. It was the dead hour, the time when the city finally held its breath. The lobby was silent, save for the hum of the ventilation system. Eleanor stood behind the high quartz desk, fighting the heaviness of her eyelids. Then, the revolving doors spun. The motion was smooth, confident, and aggressive. A gust of freezing wind followed the man inside, cutting through the perfumed air. Harrison Blackwood entered his building. He was the architect who had designed this tower, and he walked through it as if he were inspecting a flaw in the foundation. At 34, Harrison was a figure of imposing solitude. He wore a long charcoal wool coat with the collar turned up, framing a face that was devastatingly handsome but carved from ice. His jaw was sharp, his brow perpetually furrowed in thought, and his eyes, dark, intelligent, and weary, scanned the room without truly seeing it. He was the Prince of Steel, a man who built skyscrapers to touch the clouds but refused to let anyone touch him. Eleanor straightened her posture instantly. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood." Harrison didn't stop. He didn't look at her. He simply raised a hand in a dismissive, habitual wave as he strode toward the private elevator bank. "Evening," he muttered, the word falling flat, a reflex rather than a greeting. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. He stepped in, the doors closed, and he was gone, whisked away to the penthouse that sat above the city like a lonely crown. Eleanor let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. It was the same routine every night. He came home late, alone, smelling of winter air and isolation. He treated her like the marble pillar next to the desk, necessary for the structure but devoid of a soul. She slumped slightly, the facade cracking in the solitude. To keep herself awake, she pulled a small, tattered notebook from her pocket. It wasn't a logbook. It was a score, box cello suites. She couldn't play anymore. She had sold her cello to pay for her mother's funeral, but she could still hear the music in her head. She placed the notebook on the quartz counter. Her fingers began to move against the cold stone, pressing down on invisible strings, tapping out the rhythm, her head swaying slightly to a melody only she could hear. For a moment, she wasn't the concierge. She was the musician, lost in a crescendo of silent passion. She was so absorbed in the phantom music that she didn't hear the elevator descend. She didn't hear the soft chime. She didn't hear the footsteps approaching the desk, slower this time, deliberate. That's the prelude in G major. The voice was deep, resonant, and shockingly close. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her chest as she snapped her head up. Harrison Blackwood was standing on the other side of the desk. He hadn't gone to bed. He had come back down. He wasn't wearing his coat anymore. He was in a white dress shirt, the top button undone, his tie loose. He looked tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that shadowed his eyes. But for the first time in 6 months, those eyes were locked onto hers. They weren't looking through her. They were looking at her. "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor stammered, quickly closing the notebook and shoving it under a ledger. "I apologize. I was distracted. Do you need a car? Did you forget something?" Harrison didn't answer the question. He leaned his forearms against the high desk, invading her personal space. The scent of him, sandalwood and expensive scotch, filled her senses. He looked at the spot on the counter where her fingers had been dancing moments ago. "You were playing it," he said softly. "I saw your fingers. The vibrato. The shift in position. You weren't just tapping, Eleanor. You were playing." Eleanor froze. He knew her name. He had never said it before, but he knew it. And he knew the music. "I used to play," she whispered, unable to lie under the intensity of his gaze. "A long time ago. Why did you stop?" Harrison asked. "Life is expensive, sir," she deflected, retreating behind her professional mask. "Is there something I can help you with?" Harrison stared at her. He saw the defensive wall go up the same way he built his own towers. He saw the flush in her cheeks, the way her hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. 4 months he had walked past her, pretending she was part of the architecture. But tonight, the silence of his penthouse had been too loud, and the image of the girl in the lobby conducting an invisible orchestra had drawn him down like gravity. "I can't sleep," Harrison confessed. The vulnerability in his voice was jarring, a crack in the ice. "I can call a doctor, or—" "No," he interrupted. He looked at her, his eyes dark and searching. "I don't need a doctor. I need to know why the girl who opens the door for everyone else looks like she's trying to escape every time she thinks no one is watching." Eleanor held his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The barrier between employer and employee, between the prince and the pauper, thinned dangerously. "Maybe I am escaping, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Maybe the music is the only place I have left." Harrison looked at her for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched between them, charged with a sudden, terrifying electricity. "Then don't stop," he whispered, his voice rough. "Because when you stopped, the lobby went cold again." He pushed away from the desk, turning his back on her before she could respond. He walked toward the elevators, leaving Eleanor standing in the stunned silence of the night, realizing with a jolt of adrenaline that the man who pretended she meant nothing had been watching her closely enough to see the music in her fingertips. And for the first time, she wondered if he was coming down to the lobby not for the city, but for her. The pattern established itself not with words, but with the quiet, inevitable rhythm of the tides. For the next 2 weeks, the witching hour at the Obsidian was no longer a time of solitude for Eleanor. At precisely 3 a.m., the elevator would descend from the 60th floor. The soft chime would herald his arrival, and Harrison Blackwood would step out into the lobby, shedding the armor of his day to stand in the quiet sanctuary of her night. He never called it a visit. He called it insomnia. He claimed the penthouse was too quiet, that the wind at that altitude howled like a trapped animal. He would bring a stack of blueprints or a sketchbook, sitting in one of the velvet armchairs near the concierge desk under the pretense of working. But he rarely looked at the papers. Eleanor learned to navigate this new, dangerous geography. She would prepare a pot of black tea, Earl Grey loose leaf, and place it silently on the low table beside him. She was the concierge, and he was the owner. Service was her shield. But Harrison had begun to chip away at that shield, not with force, but with a terrifying, persistent curiosity. "You changed the music," Harrison said one night, his voice cutting through the hum of the heater. He was sketching, charcoal moving over paper in sharp, aggressive strokes. Eleanor stood behind the desk, organizing mail she had already organized 3 times. "Sir, the playlist," he said, looking up. His eyes were shadowed, dark pools that seemed to pull her in. It used to be modern jazz. Tonight, it's Rachmaninoff. The vocalize. I thought the building needed something with a heartbeat tonight, Eleanor confessed, gripping the edge of the marble counter. The wind is cold. Jazz felt too hollow. Harrison stopped drawing. He looked around the lobby he had designed. The soaring ceilings, the sharp angles of steel and glass, the cold perfection of it all. I designed this place to be a monument, Harrison murmured, his gaze returning to her. But you treat it like a living thing. You give it a pulse. Buildings have souls, Mr. Blackwood, Eleanor replied softly. They remember the people who walk through them, even if the people don't remember the building. Harrison stood up. The movement was fluid, restless. He walked over to the desk, bringing the scent of sandalwood and sleeplessness with him. He placed his hands on the quartz, leaning in, reducing the safety of the distance between them. "And what about you, Eleanor?" he asked. The use of her name sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the drafty doors. "Who remembers you? You stand here every night, guarding the sleep of people who don't even know your last name." "My name is on the badge," she whispered, looking down at the brass pin on her lapel. "I didn't ask about the badge," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "I asked about the woman who plays Bach on a countertop when she thinks the world isn't watching." He reached out. It was a slow, deliberate movement. His fingers brushed against her hand, which was resting on the ledger. The contact was electric, a sudden, sharp jolt that made the air in the lobby feel thin. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the perpetual chill that seemed to cling to Eleanor's bones. We stand on opposite sides of a glass wall, pressing our hands against the reflection, hoping to feel the heat. Eleanor didn't pull away. She couldn't. She was paralyzed by the look in his eyes, a look of raw, unvarnished hunger. It wasn't just desire. It was a desperate need for connection, for someone to witness him not as the architect, but as the man who couldn't sleep because his mind was too loud. "You sold the cello," Harrison stated, his thumb grazing her knuckle. "Why?" "To pay for a headstone," Eleanor answered, the truth slipping out before she could catch it. "My mother. She deserved marble, not dirt." Harrison flinched. The admission hung between them, heavy and tragic. He looked at her uniform, at the cheap fabric that scratched her skin, and then at the luxury surrounding them, luxury he had built, luxury that meant nothing to him in the face of her sacrifice. "I could buy you a cello," Harrison said. "I could fill this lobby with 100 of them." "I don't want your charity, Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor said, finally pulling her hand back, tucking it safely behind her back. "Music isn't about the instrument. It's about the feeling. And I can't play if I owe you the bow." Harrison stared at her. He looked at the defiance in her eyes, the proud tilt of her chin. In a world of sycophants and yes-men, she was the only one who drew a line in the sand. And God help him, he wanted to cross it. "You're right," he conceded softly. "I can't buy the music, but I can stay and listen to the silence with you." He didn't go back upstairs. He stayed in the lobby until 5 a.m., sitting in the armchair, watching her work. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the things they couldn't say, about loneliness, about the weight of expectation, about the strange, magnetic pull that kept bringing the prince down from his tower to sit with the gatekeeper. But the dawn brings clarity, and with it, the return of the real world. At 6 a.m., the revolving door spun. It wasn't a resident returning from a late night. It was a woman. She was stunning, dressed in a white cashmere coat that looked like new snow. Her blonde hair was perfectly coiffed, her makeup flawless even at this ungodly hour. She carried a sleek leather briefcase and walked with the entitlement of someone who owned the pavement she stepped on. This was Julianne Vance, the lead investor of the Obsidian Group and Harrison's business partner. And according to the society pages, his intended future. Julianne stopped in the center of the lobby. She looked at Harrison, who was still sitting in the armchair, rumpled and tired. Then she looked at Eleanor, standing behind the desk, wide-eyed and pale. Julianne's eyes narrowed. She didn't see a concierge. She saw a complication. "Harrison!" Julianne's voice was sharp, cutting through the morning calm like a diamond cutter. "You're down here? I've been calling the penthouse for an hour. We have the zoning meeting at 7. Harrison stood up slowly, the mask of a prince of steel sliding back into place. But he hesitated. He looked at Eleanor one last time, a look of apology, of regret, of a door closing. "I was working, Julianne," Harrison said flatly. "The lobby has better light." "The lobby is for staff and guests, Harrison," Julianne said, walking over to him and looping her arm through his. She cast a cold, dismissive glance at Eleanor. "And it looks like the shift change is coming. Let's go. You smell like stale tea." Eleanor froze. She watched as Julianne pulled him toward the elevators. Harrison didn't look back. He couldn't. He let himself be led away, ascending back into the sky, leaving Eleanor grounded in the marble cage, realizing with a sinking heart that while he might visit her world in the dark, he belonged to a world that would never let him stay. The following week, the silence of the lobby was murdered. The Obsidian was no longer a sanctuary of midnight whispers and shared tea. It was transformed into a dazzling, deafening stage for the city's architectural elite. It was the night of the Keystone Gala, a black tie event celebrating Harrison Blackwood's triumph in urban design. The lobby, usually a cavern of cool shadows, was flooded with warm, golden light, filled with mountains of white roses and a sea of people who spoke in millions. Eleanor was not behind the quartz desk. That station had been commandeered by event planners. Instead, she had been relegated to the coat check, a small, claustrophobic alcove hidden behind a velvet curtain near the entrance. She was no longer the gatekeeper. She was the servant of the servants, taking cashmere coats and mink stoles from guests who didn't look her in the eye. She wore her uniform, but it felt tighter tonight, like a corset made of shame. Through the gap in the curtain, she could see him. Harrison stood in the center of the room, holding a crystal award. He looked like a god of the modern age, tall, severe, and devastatingly distant. He was surrounded by investors, critics, and admirers, but his eyes were vacant. He smiled when required, shook hands when approached, but he carried himself with a rigidity that Eleanor recognized. It was the armor he wore to survive the noise. She watched him, her heart aching with a foolish, desperate hope that he might look toward the desk, toward the shadows, looking for her. But he didn't. He was anchored by Julian Vance, who shimmered in a silver gown that clung to her like liquid mercury. She never left his side. She was the gatekeeper now. We build walls to keep the world out, never realizing that the higher they rise, the less air we have to breathe. Around midnight, the crowd began to thin, moving toward the after-party in the penthouse. The lobby quieted, leaving behind the debris of excess, empty glasses, fallen petals, and the heavy scent of perfume. Eleanor stepped out from behind the curtain to collect a tray of abandoned flutes near the elevators. She didn't see Julianne until it was too late. The woman was standing by the concierge desk, holding something in her manicured hand. It was small, tattered, familiar. It was Eleanor's notebook, the score of Bach's cello suites. Eleanor froze. She had left it under the ledger, hidden. Julianne must have been rummaging for a pen or a card. "Excuse me," Eleanor said, her voice trembling but audible. "That belongs to me." Julianne turned slowly. Her eyes were glazed with champagne and cold amusement. She looked at the notebook, then at Eleanor, a slow, pitying smile spreading across her face. "This!" Julianne laughed softly, flipping through the pages covered in Eleanor's handwritten notes. "Harrison, look at this. I found it tucked under the ledger. It's charming in a way, like finding a child's drawing on a boardroom table. I suppose everyone needs a hobby to distract them from the reality of their station." Just then, the elevator chimed. Harrison stepped out. He had come down to escort the last VIPs, but seeing the scene, he stopped. He looked at Julianne, holding the notebook like a curious artifact, and then at Eleanor, who stood pale and shaking in the center of the room. The heir left the lobby. Harrison, Julianne cooed, waving the notebook slightly. Your little concierge plays pretend. She thinks she's a composer. It's almost tragic, isn't it? Harrison looked at the notebook. He knew exactly what it was. He knew that book contained the only piece of her soul she had left. He remembered the way her fingers danced on the marble counter, the way her eyes closed when she heard the music in her head. He knew that to Eleanor, this wasn't just paper, it was her breath. He walked over to Julianne and gently took the notebook from her hand. For a moment, time suspended. Harrison's fingers tightened around the worn leather cover. For a fleeting second, his gaze flickered to Eleanor. She saw the mask slip. She saw the apology forming on his lips, a desperate desire to hand it back to her and claim her right there in the golden light. Her heart soared. He was going to save her. But then he felt the weight of the room. He felt the eyes of the investors standing behind him, the men who held the funding for his next skyscraper, the men who judged stability by the company one kept. He saw Julianne's cold, expectant smile, a reminder of the debt that could crush his empire in a heartbeat. If he defended the help, he would look weak. He would look compromised. The apology died in his throat. Harrison Blackwood made a choice. It was a choice made of steel and ice, the materials he trusted most. Even as they cut him, he turned his gaze away from Eleanor and looked at the trash bin beside the desk. It's clutter, Julianne, Harrison said, his voice flat, though his hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he held the book over the bin. The staff knows personal items aren't allowed at the front desk. It looks unprofessional. He dropped the notebook. The sound of it hitting the metal bottom was soft, but to Eleanor, it sounded like a cello string snapping, a violent final break. Harrison turned his back on the bin and on Eleanor. He offered his arm to Julianne. Let's go. The investors are waiting. Harrison, Eleanor whispered. The single word was a prayer that died in the air. He paused. His shoulders stiffened under the tuxedo jacket. For a heartbeat, he looked like he might shatter, like a man screaming behind a glass wall. But he didn't turn around. He couldn't. Clean up the lobby, he commanded, speaking to the air, refusing to say her name because he knew if he said it, he would break. It's a mess. He walked into the elevator with Julianne, the door sliding shut on his stoic, terrible face. Eleanor stood alone in the golden light of the gala. She looked at the bin. She looked at the empty elevator. The pain wasn't sharp. It was a dull, suffocating weight that crushed her lungs. He hadn't just rejected her, he had erased her. He had taken the intimate silence they shared and filled it with the noise of his ambition. She walked over to the bin and retrieved the notebook. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. She held it to her chest, feeling the cold seep into her bones. She realized then that the warmth she had felt during those 3 a.m. visits was a hallucination. He was a prince of steel, and she was just a ghost haunting his lobby. She didn't finish her shift. She took off her badge, the one he had claimed not to care about, and placed it on the quartz desk. She walked out of the revolving doors, into the biting wind of the Manhattan night, leaving the obsidian behind. She was no longer the invisible woman. She was gone. And Harrison Blackwood, high in his tower, poured a drink he couldn't swallow, staring at the city lights, knowing he had just destroyed the only beautiful thing he had ever designed. 3 nights passed, and the obsidian stood tall against the Manhattan skyline, a monolith of glass and light. To the city, it was a symbol of perfection. But inside, the lobby was a tomb. The new night concierge was a man named Peter, efficient, polite, and utterly devoid of soul. He didn't hum. He didn't tap his fingers on the quartz. He simply guarded the door, leaving the space feeling hollow, cold, and dead. Harrison Blackwood sat in his penthouse, 60 floors above the street, staring at the panoramic window. The city lights blurred into streaks of meaningless color. He hadn't slept in 72 hours. The silence he had once claimed to crave was now a physical weight, crushing his chest. He had the funding. He had the approval of the investors. Julianne was satisfied. He had won. So why did he feel like a man standing in the wreckage of a collapsed building? He looked at the coffee table. There, sitting on a coaster, was the brass name badge Eleanor. He had taken it from the desk the morning she left. It was the only piece of her that remained in his world. The truth was a bitter pill he had been choking on for years. The obsidian wasn't a triumph, it was a cage. His firm was over-leveraged, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. The Prince of Steel was a pauper in a tuxedo. Julianne's father held the debt that kept the lights on. Harrison had thrown Eleanor's notebook into the bin not because he despised it, but because he was terrified. If Julianne sensed even a fracture in his focus, if she sensed that he cared more for a concierge's melody than a billionaire's money, she would pull the financing. He had sacrificed the only real thing in his life to save a lie. We build walls to keep the world out, but eventually the walls run out of air. Harrison stood up. He grabbed his coat. He didn't call the driver. He didn't call Julianne. He walked out of the penthouse, took the elevator down, past the silent, empty lobby, and walked out into the street. He had her address from the HR file. It was in Queens, a world away from the meatpacking district. It began to snow, soft, silent flakes that covered the grime of the city. Harrison stood in the hallway of a cramped walk-up building, the smell of boiling cabbage and damp wool in the air. He knocked on door 4B. He waited. His heart, usually a steady metronome, was hammering an erratic rhythm. The door opened. Eleanor stood there. She wasn't wearing the midnight blue uniform. She wore an oversized sweater and leggings, her hair loose and messy. She looked tired, her eyes rimmed with red, but when she saw him, her expression hardened into stone. She didn't wait for him to speak. She tried to slam the door. Harrison jammed his expensive leather boot into the gap. "Eleanor, wait!" he pleaded, his voice rough. She pushed harder against the door, the wood crushing against his ankle, but he didn't flinch. He took the pain as if he deserved it. "Get out!" she hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "Go back to your tower, Mr. Blackwood. You made your point. I'm trash. I'm clutter. Leave before I call the police. I lied." Harrison shouted through the crack, desperation cracking his composure. "I lied, Eleanor. I don't care if you lied," she fired back, not letting up the pressure on the door. "You erased me. You threw me away like I was nothing to save your precious reputation." "I'm not here for my reputation," Harrison said, his voice dropping to a broken whisper that carried through the gap. "I'm here because I haven't heard music in 3 days. And the silence is killing me." Eleanor froze. The pressure on the door eased slightly. It wasn't an apology, it was a confession of starvation. She looked at him through the crack, disheveled, snow melting in his hair, his eyes pleading. She finally pulled the door open. Harrison stepped into her small apartment. It was the size of his walk-in closet. A small kitchenette, a worn sofa, and in the corner, a music stand with a tattered notebook open. "You kept it," he breathed, looking at the score. "I fished it out of the bin after you left," Eleanor said, her voice still cold, standing with her arms crossed defensively. "Because unlike you, I don't throw away the things that matter." "I didn't want to throw it away," Harrison confessed, standing awkwardly in the center of the room. He looked at her, stripping away the arrogance, the facade. "I had to. You had to." Eleanor laughed bitterly. Was the notebook threatening the structural integrity of the lobby? Or did it just embarrass you in front of your girlfriend? "She isn't my girlfriend," Harrison said, taking a step closer. "She's my loan shark." Eleanor froze. What? The obsidian is broke, Eleanor, Harrison admitted, the words tumbling out. My firm is drowning in debt. Julianne's family owns the mortgage. If I don't play the part of the perfect, unfeeling architect, if I don't marry her, they call the loans. I lose everything. The building, the employees, the legacy. Everything. He held his hands open, exposing his palms. I threw your book away because if Julianne saw that I cared about you, that I cared about anything other than the deal, she would have destroyed you just to teach me a lesson. I hurt you to protect the deal. And I thought I could live with that. And can you? Eleanor asked, her eyes searching his face, seeing the ruins of the man beneath the coat. No, Harrison whispered. I haven't slept since you left. The lobby is quiet, Eleanor, but it's the wrong kind of silence. It's dead. You were the heartbeat. I pretended you meant nothing because I couldn't afford to want you. But every night, you were the only reason I stayed awake. I came downstairs because being near you was the only time I felt like a human being and not a machine. The confession hung in the air, heavy and raw. He wasn't the Prince of Steel. He was a man trapped in a golden ruin, starving for something real. Eleanor looked at him. She saw the exhaustion etched into his features, the fear he had carried alone. But she held her ground. You chose the building, Harrison, she said softly, but with infinite sadness. You chose the steel. You can't just walk in here and tell me you're sorry because you're lonely. I'm not choosing the building anymore, Harrison said. He reached into his coat pocket. Eleanor braced herself, expecting money, a check, a payoff. Instead, he pulled out a folded piece of heavy paper. It was a resignation letter from his own firm, and a withdrawal of his marriage proposal to Julianne. I sent this an hour ago, Harrison said, placing the paper on her small table. The deal is dead. They will likely seize the obsidian by the end of the month. I will be bankrupt. I will be a laughingstock in the architectural review. You gave it up? Eleanor breathed, looking from the paper to him, shock replacing the anger. Everything. It wasn't everything, Harrison corrected her. He stepped closer, entering her personal space, bringing the scent of snow and sandalwood. It was just walls. I realized that I would rather live in a ruin with music than in a palace with silence. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and brushed a stray hair from her forehead. I have nothing to offer you now, Eleanor. No penthouse, no influence. Just a man who is incredibly tired of pretending. Eleanor looked at him. She saw the risk he had taken. He had burned his world to the ground just to stand in her hallway and tell her the truth. The anger in her chest began to dissolve, replaced by the familiar, magnetic pull that had drawn them together in the dark hours of the morning. You're a fool, Harrison Blackwood, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I know, he replied, his thumb grazing her cheek. But I'm awake now. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, just an inch, a silent permission. It wasn't a full forgiveness, not yet. The wounds were too fresh. But as the snow fell outside the window, blanketing the city in white, the wall between them cracked. He had destroyed his tower to find her, and in doing so, he had finally laid a foundation that was real enough to build on. The Fall of the Prince of Steel was the headline of the month. The architectural journals called it a tragic implosion. The tabloids called it a scandal of the heart. Harrison Blackwood had walked away from the 60-story masterpiece that defined the skyline, leaving the keys on the desk and the dead in the hands of the Vances. The obsidian remained standing, a cold, glittering needle in the sky, but the man who designed it had vanished into the concrete folds of the burrow across the river. Winter eventually bled into a hesitant, wet spring. The snow melted into gray slush, revealing the grit of the city beneath. In a converted warehouse loft in Brooklyn, a space with exposed brick, drafty windows, and erratic heating, Harrison sat at a second-hand drafting table. He wasn't designing a skyscraper. He was sketching a porch for a small community library in Queens. He wore a flannel shirt, The sleeves rolled up to his elbows. There was ink on his fingers and a smudge of graphite on his cheek. He looked tired, yes, but it was the good kind of tired, the exhaustion of creation, not maintenance. The silence in the loft wasn't the curated, expensive silence of the penthouse. It was filled with the sounds of a street below, the hum of the refrigerator, and the soft rustle of pages turning. Eleanor sat on the worn rug, near the radiator, reading. She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wore a soft, yellow sweater that made her look like a piece of the sun that had fallen indoors. They were broke. Or at least, New York broke. Harrison's assets had been seized to pay the creditors. His reputation dragged through the mud. They ate takeout noodles on the floor. They took the subway. They lived a life that was small, messy, and infinitely terrifying in its uncertainty. Harrison put down his pencil. He watched Eleanor for a moment. She was tracing a line in her book, lost in a world of words. He remembered the night he had thrown her notebook into the trash, the sound of her soul hitting the metal bin. The guilt still woke him up at night, a sharp reminder of the man he used to be. "Eleanor," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. She looked up, her eyes bright and clear. "Is the library finished?" "The sketches," Harrison replied. He stood up and walked over to the corner of the room, where a large object stood, covered by a heavy blanket. He had been hiding it for 3 weeks, trading his vintage watch, the last remnant of his old life, to a pawn shop to acquire it. "I have something for you," he said. He pulled the blanket away. Standing there, glowing in the afternoon light, was a cello case. It wasn't brand new. It was battered, scuffed, and worn, bearing the scars of 1,000 concerts and 1,000 practice sessions. It was an instrument with a history, much like them. Eleanor gasped. She stood up slowly, her hands covering her mouth. She walked toward it as if it were a mirage, terrified that if she breathed too hard, it would vanish. "It's not a Stradivarius," Harrison apologized softly, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's from a music shop in the village. The owner said it has a warm tone, but the C-string is temperamental." "Harrison," Eleanor whispered, tears filling her eyes. "You sold your watch." "I don't need to know the time anymore," he shrugged, stepping closer to her. "I have nowhere else to be." Eleanor reached out and unlatched the case. The smell of rosin and old wood wafted out, a scent that triggered a visceral memory of her mother, of concert halls, of the life she thought she had lost forever. She lifted the instrument. It was heavy, solid real. She sat on the solitary wooden chair in the center of the room, positioning the cello between her knees. She tightened the bow. Harrison sat on the floor in front of her, watching with the same intensity he used to reserve for blueprints. She began to play. It was Bach, the Prelude in G major, the same piece she had tapped out on the cold quartz desk of the Obsidian. But this time, there was sound. The music filled the drafty loft, rich and resonant, bouncing off the brick walls and soaring up to the high ceiling. It wasn't perfect. Her fingers were rusty, her calluses gone, but it was alive. It was raw, weeping, and triumphant all at once. Harrison closed his eyes, letting the vibration wash over him. In that moment, he understood the true failure of his career. He had spent years trying to build structures that would make people look up in awe, but he had never built anything that made people feel. This music, this was architecture of the soul. We build walls to keep the world out, never realizing that the rubble of those walls is the only foundation strong enough to hold love. The leitmotif returned to him, but the meaning had shifted. He had torn down the walls of his ego, his wealth, and his fear. And here, in the rubble of his former life, amidst the dust and the debt, he had found the foundation he had been searching for. Eleanor finished the piece on a long, sustained note that faded into the hum of the city. She lowered the bow, her chest heaving, tears streaming down her face. She looked at Harrison. He was looking at her not as a prince looks at a subject, but as a man looks at his salvation. "You were right," Harrison whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "The lobby was dead. This is the heartbeat." Eleanor set the cello down gently and slid off the chair to the floor, crawling into his arms. He held her tight, burying his face in her hair, smelling the vanilla and the rosin. "We have nothing, Harrison," she murmured against his chest. "No building. No legacy." "We have the music," he corrected her, kissing her forehead. "And we have the quiet. That's enough." They sat together on the floor of the Brooklyn loft as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room. The obsidian was miles away, a monument to a man who no longer existed. Harrison Blackwood had lost the skyline, but he had gained the ground beneath his feet. He looked at the woman who had opened the door for him every night, the woman he had tried to erase, the woman who was now the composer of his every waking moment. He realized that for 30 years, he had been sleepwalking through a life of gold and steel. He had spent a lifetime designing skyscrapers to touch the heavens, never realizing that the only heaven worth reaching was found in the arms of the girl who played the cello in the dark.